Dopamine is the media darling of any talk surrounding pleasure and addiction. It's even entered into common conversation where someone may blame their lack of self-control on trying to get a dopamine fix, equating the naturally occurring neurotransmitter to a drug. In fact, poor dopamine has become the center of many accusations, seen as the neurotransmitter to blame for shortened attention, obesity, shopping sprees, and online arguments. It is the pleasure chemical that makes us abandon all ethics in the service of feeling good. In some way, the form in which we talk about dopamine is similar to the soma drug in Huxley's Brave New World, keeping the population subordinate from acting out through keeping them in a state of contentment. However, viewing dopamine as the pleasure chemical is only telling us a small part of a very complex and nuanced story. This video is sponsored by Blinkist. As I've mentioned before, I have a problem where I will try to get any book a friend recommends to me. This is great in some sense because one of the healthiest habits you can cultivate is reading. At the same time, there's an infinite amount of books out there and I have a limited amount of time. Thankfully, there's Blinkist, an app that allows you to understand the most important things from over 5,500 nonfiction books and podcasts across 27 different categories, all in just 15 minutes. Whether you want to read a book while going for a run or doing some chores, Blinkist allows you to understand exciting ideas and theories whenever and wherever. Recently, I've been going through Sapolsky's other popular book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, that goes over the complex and highly relevant physiology behind stress. I found his conversation around sleep and addiction and the role of stress especially interesting. I would highly recommend this book to anyone who likes Sapolsky. Now there's also Blinkist Connect, a new feature which allows every Blinkist premium plan to be shared by 2 different accounts with no additional cost. This enables you to invite a second account to join your plan. This gives you a 2 for the price of 1 deal and makes discovering new interests a shared activity. Click the link or scan the QR code to start your 7-day free trial and get 25% off a premium membership. Perhaps a better way to conceptualize pleasure is in terms of reward. After all, is this not the byproduct of the most worthy of rewards, whether it be love, success, or freedom? When we pursue such rewards, we do in fact engage with the dopaminergic system. Pleasurable stimuli from an adorable puppy to cocaine activates tegmental neurons that then trigger the release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Dopamine can even be triggered by aesthetics, such as listening to a beautiful song. Conversely, stress and pain generally deplete dopamine. Too much of this can lead to a decreased sensitivity in stimulation, which results in anhedonia, a key marker of depression that is defined as the inability to feel pleasure. There is also a darker side to dopamine. In a study, when individuals are told about a person that would provoke envy, cortical regions involved in pain are activated. Then, if we hear that the envied person experiences a misfortune, dopamine is released. This is Schadenfreude, and also links dopamine with jealousy and resentment. The most commonly cited mechanism behind dopamine is its unfortunate propensity towards habituation. If you taught someone to press a button 10 times in order to get a small scoop of ice cream, their dopamine will go up. Then, later on, if the person pressed the button 10 times and received a double scoop of ice cream, their dopamine goes up even higher before plateauing to the same level as before. Unfortunately, if this person receives a small scoop of ice cream again, their dopamine levels will actually decline. If dopamine was truly the pleasure chemical, it would code for the objective value of the reward. Instead, it appears that dopamine codes for the discrepancy from expectation. This is also kind of how our world is mostly shaped, by extreme unnatural rewards that our bodies are not evolutionarily prepared for. Carefully designed sugary and salty foods, access to millions of images of attractive sexual partners, and constant stimulation in terms of the novelty that comes from social media consistently elevates the discrepancy from our expectation. As Sapolsky writes, an emptiness comes from this combination of over-the-top, non-natural sources of reward and the inevitability of habituation. This is because unnaturally strong explosions of synthetic experience and sensation and pleasure evoke unnaturally strong degrees of habituation. As a consequence, we are less likely to notice the smaller pleasures, and we become more likely to habituate to increasingly more intense sources of pleasure. Sapolsky notes that if we were designed by engineers, as we consumed more, we'd desire less. But our frequent human tragedy is that the more we consume, the hungrier we get. This has led to the idea behind the dopamine detox, where those whose daily existence is characterized by endless scrolling, Uber Eats orders, online shopping, and video games finally take a look in the mirror and pledge to willingly deprive themselves of pleasure. In simpler terms, they commit to a dopamine fast. Although this may include certain healthy habits such as meditation and good sleep hygiene, it can also include depriving yourself from listening to music, socializing, and not eating. This is all in the service of enhancing life's simpler pleasures through weaning off dopamine like it's a drug. However, as one professor states, we could all serve to unplug every once in a while, but to attribute any perceived benefits to reduced dopamine levels is an oversimplification and misrepresentation of the complexity of the nervous system. Basically, one cannot actually lower their dopamine levels, especially through fasting. If the cells are not firing, dopamine that has already been synthesized will still be there, waiting to be released. The idea that one could lower dopamine levels through a rigid practice of deprivation is simply pseudoscientific. Just because your dopamine rises in response to rewards doesn't mean that it will lower when you stop acquiring them. In fact, we wouldn't want our dopamine levels to lower, as dopamine is critically important in the stress response, eating behaviors, and movement. Dopamine is crucial in helping us to pay attention and learn about the signals in the environment that are motivationally relevant. If anything, going cold turkey and depriving oneself of rewards could simply lead to a pathological binging filled with an inevitable shame that brings you back to where you are. So what's a better way to manage your dopamine, if there even is such a method? Firstly, we should resist the idea of labeling dopamine as simply the pleasure chemical, something that the dopamine detox community tends to do. Studies have shown that dopamine not only rises when rewards are achieved, it also arises when there's near misses, such as in the brains of gamblers. Instead of signaling pleasure, dopamine appears to indicate how close you get to a reward. Why? Because this encourages us to make another attempt. Dopamine is less about pleasure and more about motivation. Dopamine is also less about rewards than it is about our anticipation. Specifically, it's activated when we feel masterful and confident that we know things are going to work. The pleasure that comes from dopamine is mostly rooted in the anticipation of the reward, and the reward itself is more of an afterthought. This is comically depicted in Sapolsky's observation of his roommate in college who was a serial dater that could never establish a stable relationship. As his roommate told him, a relationship is the price you pay for the anticipation of it. This emphasis on expectation also explains the issue with addiction. Anticipation, the confidence that we know something will happen, requires us to learn certain cues. Thus, ex-alcoholics returning to where alcohol consumption used to occur will begin to experience context-dependent cravings. Even the cues themselves can become rewarding and addicting. For example, rats can be conditioned to work towards being exposed to a certain cue that signals some kind of reward is likely without knowing what that reward exactly is. Sapolsky argues that the magnitude of anticipatory dopamine levels reflects two main variables. Firstly, there is the size of the anticipated reward. This explains why we can engage in long-term pursuit, knowing that delayed gratification could bring us an even larger reward in the future. Secondly, there is the level of intermittent reinforcement. The more random and low the odds are in terms of getting the reward, the higher the actual anticipatory dopamine. This explains the near misses for gambling addicts and why you'll spend hours on YouTube just to find one video you might actually like. Now we can reframe dopamine from being about the happiness of the reward to instead being about the happiness of the pursuit of the reward. In this sense, common depictions of the dopamine detox are misguided. Instead, I suggest a slight alteration to dopamine detox where, instead of removing the source of motivation entirely, we recenter these sources and focus more on the journey rather than the destination. This is perhaps best exemplified by Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Both agreed that suffering is an inherent component to human existence. As Schopenhauer writes, a man is never happy but spends his whole life in striving after something that he thinks will make him so. He seldom attains his goal, and when he does, it is only to be disappointed. He is mostly shipwrecked in the end, and comes into harbor with mast and rigging gone. Hence, Schopenhauer advocates for a renunciation from enjoyment, seeing all pleasure as really only negative. By building a fireproof room through a life of asceticism and self-control, we can be free. Nietzsche, on the other hand, felt that the construction of this fireproof room was a way to hide from the world. Instead of hiding from feeling anything at all, we should instead find a way to live in it and to maybe even find gratitude for existence. In this, he developed the idea of the pessimism of the energetic, where we simultaneously confront the perpetual suffering of humanity and nonetheless enjoy the fruits of life. To do this is to reevaluate the things we truly value. Rather than deprive ourselves of that which makes us happy, we should instead take on the much more arduous task of redefining the things that make us happy. This is pretty close to dopamine detox in some ways. Replacing video games with joining a sports team or replacing eating out with cooking is far more effective and logically more bang for your buck in terms of tapping into the delayed gratification and expectancy system that dopamine is coded for when we compare it to simply removing any rewards altogether. Rather than hiding from life, we should instead ask ourselves what makes us truly happy. Easier said than done, but then again, that's the very nature of trends and fads such as dopamine detoxes that offer intuitive solutions through simplified science. If being happy was easy, then everyone would be.